Hi, this is Recompile, and in this video we're going to go over how to interpret an EvoScan data log and how to relate that to ecuflash and how to actually begin tuning your Evo. So this is geared towards newcomers. If you're already familiar with how to interpret an EvoScan log and how to make basic edits to ecuflash, you may want to skip this video, but it's also a good beginner to intermediate level if you just want to get familiar with the basics of interpreting a data log and how to correlate that into changes that should be made in your tune in ecuflash. So EvoScan creates comma-separated data log files, and it stores them in the EvoScan Save Data Logs folder under Program Files, EvoScan, your version number, and Save Data Logs. I've created a subfolder just for my particular logs because I've got logs from other people also on this laptop. So as you can see, I've got a whole heck of a lot of data logs here that I've done to my car over the months. I just picked any random one at any time. This is one from last year. So ideally, you'd look at something like this, a comma-separated value file in a spreadsheet program like Excel. Gives you a nice breakdown of all the values that you've logged. So at the first row we've got the header entry to tell you what's in this column. One of the nice features of Excel is being able to filter specific values, and particularly what I was tuning on this particular poll, it looks like, or this particular data log, is a wide open throttle pull where throttle position is 100%. So if that's all we care about for this log, I'll just go in here and set a filter for throttle position equal to 100%. So all that does is hide any type of non-full throttle data that might be in this log. You can use that for various different tuning needs. If you need to look at specifically maybe where your wideband went extremely rich or extremely lean, or maybe you're looking at a certain RPM range, you can set limits with the filter option in Excel. So with that filter, we know we're looking at the data that we really care about, and we can now begin to understand exactly what happened to the car as we went through this full throttle pull. So it looks like we started at about 3160 RPM, and at that time, logging our 2-byte load, as we described how to set that up in the previous video, at this time was 280 load, airflow of about just over 1000 Hertz, with 4 degrees of ignition timing. We don't happen to have a wideband item from this particular moment in time, but that's not uncommon when logging an external wideband. Sometimes they just don't match up to exactly the same logging rate as EvoScan can with the MUP protocol. So there may be some gaps depending on what can log faster. We happen to have 0 knock at this moment in time. That's great. Now you'll notice that boost or JDM map, as it's sometimes referred to, is available on my log, but this isn't available to you from the factory with a typical Evo 8 or 9. And the reason is because the stock Evo map sensor is not a 3-bar map sensor. It doesn't allow you to log any significant accurate levels of boost experienced in the intake manifold. But luckily you can get one from Japan, or you can get one from, I believe the US dealerships now sell them as Evo 10 map sensors, and these will actually allow you to log with EvoScan what the manifold pressure is in the intake manifold. So now you don't have to visually look at a boost gauge to log boost or to tune boost. You can log that along with everything else side by side and really make use of EvoScan and ecuflash. So that's an intermediate level use of ecuflash and EvoScan to your advantage, being able to log boost. It's really helpful. You can actually use it as well to control boost, to basically convert the stock ECU into a full PSI programmable electronic boost controller. So you can save yourself a few $100 and just get a JDM map sensor, put it in, make the changes in ecuflash, make the changes in EvoScan, and you can log and control boost directly. So these are the kind of really great things that some of the disassemblers and developers have determined over the years of how to fully utilize the capabilities of the stock ECU. It's one of the real reasons that make it uh, one of the best ECUs that I've seen from the factory. So I'm logging boost at this point in time is 24.7 pounds, and I'm also in this instance logging wastegate duty cycle and other things, injector duty cycle, and so on. So what we really need to worry about, probably first and foremost, the most obvious way to understand how your tune is operating, and the most glaring of things that you can log that would identify possible problems in your tune, would be knock or knock sum. In this case, looks like through most of this wide open throttle pull, we're not experiencing any knock, which is great. As we scroll down, getting through the RPM band here, 6,000, 65. Okay, so we started to experience knock at 6,636 RPM. We experienced 3 counts of knock. Now, knock is measured in degrees and will give you an indication of how severe this knock sensor believes the knock to be based on the harmonics that it's recording. So if the knock sensor happens to think that this knock is very severe, it's going to put a significant value into this knock sum, something 3 or greater. Typically, if you see a 1 or a 2, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have a problem with your tune or that you have a problem with your car. Those can oftentimes just be basic engine noise, road noise. If you have a lot of mods done to the car, there's a lot of different things that can cause knock, downpipe rattling. But in most cases, knock is real, so don't be quick to attribute it to false knock, especially when it comes in long strings like we have here, where the knock started and persisted. This is most definitely real knock, and it's not too bad, but it's definitely something we want to address, because it's not good for the car to be consistently knocking, of levels 3 or higher. So that's the first thing that you can look at to try to determine how healthy your tune is. Even from the factory, don't be surprised if you're logging some counts of knock, because there are times when Mitsubishi's tune just isn't appropriate. So it's definitely good to log your car, even if it's stock, and see the condition that your Evo is in as far as knock is concerned. Now, I also have an external wideband hooked up. I have an Innovate LC1 wideband, and I'm logging that through EvoScan as well as another very useful thing to log. And if you don't have a wideband, I would strongly suggest that you pick up one, and try to pick up one that's compatible with EvoScan so that you can log it side by side and be able to look at the data together. So having the wideband will give you the specific air-fuel ratio measured in the exhaust after the turbo, so you can get an accurate idea of how much fuel is being mixed in the engine, and if you need to add or remove fuel based on that. So it looks like in this case, throughout most of this run, air-fuel was in the vicinity of 11.5 or so, starting out a little bit leaner and getting a little bit richer as we go, which in general, as a general tuning practice, is pretty much a good target. You kind of want to shoot for the 11.5 range, with maybe a little bit leaner than that in the earlier RPM band, and a little bit richer than that in the tail end of the RPM band. So it looks like air fuel in this particular log is pretty good. Looking at timing, generally what you'll find is in most cars the timing curve, or as you call it, is going to start from a relatively low value at peak torque, and it'll ramp up as RPM goes up, as volumetric efficiency increases, as your engine's consuming more air more quickly. You'll add timing to compensate. So you'll notice that starting from the beginning of this pull, running maybe 4 or 5 degrees of timing, and as we progress, it's slowly going up to the point where at redline we're running about 11 degrees. So that's not uncommon. There is no dead set way to tune timing. Every car will vary. The same thing's true for wideband, although it's a lot more common to see similar wideband air-fuel ratios. As far as timing, it could be all over the place depending on your fuel, depending on your mods, depending on how much boost you're running, and depending on how aggressive of a tune and what type of a tune you're looking for. For a mostly stock Evo, this is probably a fairly moderate type of tune where we've maybe turned the boost up a few pounds, and we're able to run 6, 7, 8, 9, up to about 11 degrees of timing without knock or without any significant knock. Now, before we go any further, I'd just like to show you, you're probably familiar, if you're familiar with Excel, you know it can chart things. So if we take timing, for example, and we insert a line graph, we can get an idea of the progression of timing as we progress through our wide open throttle pull. So this can be helpful because it'll help you understand any obvious deficiencies in your tune. As I said, in general, timing will generally start low and ramp up high as the wide open throttle RPM increases, which in general is what we have here. Now, the other thing to note is that if you do have knock along with your log, the knock is going to affect how much timing is actually getting used by the engine, by the ECU. So you'll probably note that timing can at times be hindered by knock. So if you notice some strangeness in the timing curve, it could be because you have knock at that same point in time. We can do the same for wideband just to get an idea of how the chart looks. In this case, like I said, we kind of start on the lean side of the 11.5 mid, and we end up on the rich side. So that's not a bad air fuel map right there. And I believe this was still in the stock turbo at this point, so let's take a look at how boost was looking at that point in time. So it's a little flaky. It doesn't necessarily hold boost too consistently up top, so this might indicate that we have maybe a boost leak, maybe we have a boost controller problem. If we're using the stock ECU to control boost, there could be some headache there that we need to address. And you'll find this pretty typical of a stock turbo. It just can't maintain high levels of boost for very long. Once you pass 5,000-6,000 RPM, it's going to start to taper pretty significantly down to about 21 or 20 pounds. So that's to be expected. But this will give you an idea. If you're logging boost with a 3-bar map sensor, you get an idea of how your boost profile looks. Maybe give you an insight into boost controller problems, wastegate problems, boost leak problems. They should be apparent along with the boost log. The other thing I'll show you while we're here is logging 2-by load. We'll give that a line graph. And this line kind of looks similar to what we just looked at when we looked at boost. And that's because load in general does mimic boost and does mimic torque. You'll find that horsepower follows more closely with airflow. So load will peak early when the turbo is spooled up, and if especially in the case of a small turbo where it just can't keep up with the amount of air that the engine can consume, you're going to see load to taper off down towards the end. So you'll find that load and boost follow similar profiles: load, boost, and torque. And we can actually just make a quick new column here. We'll call it load over 10. We'll just give it whatever the value of the load column is divided by 10. We'll just replicate that down to the rest of this log here. And let's log load over 10 side by side with boost. I just held control and hit both columns. And like I said, load and boost follow very similar patterns. So this is another great point to try to identify possible boost leaks. Again, this won't apply to you if you're not logging boost, but hey, it's a great thing to do if you're going to be tuning your car significantly, making a lot of adjustments with boost. But one thing that is important to know is that load is determined by the ECU from the MAF sensor. And the MAF sensor, if you're familiar, is before the turbo. So any air that turbo sucks in is going to be represented as load. That's the only place that it knows at which airflow is coming into the engine. So if you have this turbo, if your turbo is sucking in a ridiculous amount of air and load is significantly high, but that air for some reason or another is not getting into the engine and boost is significantly low, you'll see a big discrepancy in these two curves. They won't match up nicely. You may end up with a boost curve that doesn't follow a load curve, which could indicate a boost leak problem. Because if you recall, the turbo will be taking the air in, it just won't be making it all the way to the engine because of a leak. We've also logged injector duty cycle, so we can take a look at how my thresholds are here. And it looks pretty good at this point. We're not even at 80% injector duty cycle all the way through the pull, and that's great. If you're new to tuning, you definitely want to keep injector duty cycle down. Below 80 is ideal. You start getting above 80, and the injectors start to become static, and the flow pattern starts to be less than ideal. So you'll make the most power out of a set of injectors somewhere in the 80% range in most cases. So if your injector duty cycle is going beyond 80, beyond 90, even beyond 100%, you probably want to consider a new set of injectors, a bigger set of injectors. You also may want to consider a new fuel pump if you haven't got one already, because the other symptom of having an air-fuel mix that's just leaner than you'd like it to be, maybe your air-fuel mix is in the 12s instead of the 11s, but you've already added as much fuel as you can in the fuel map, and the injector duty cycle just seems maxed out at 100%. Well, it could be the injectors, but it also could be the fuel pump, because you got to remember the fuel pump has to supply additional amount of fuel depending on how much boost you're running. So there's two possibilities there. If you're leaning out, especially up top when the airflow is the greatest, and you've tried to add fuel and the injector duty cycle has gone up, but you're just not getting anything in your wideband log, it's probably your fuel pump. I've just logged some other things: speed, coolant temp, air temp. Those can be useful if you happen to be worrying about them for any given time, but in this case it doesn't do us any good, so we'll just ignore those for now. So that gives you a basic idea of the things to look for and just how to read a data log in general. Knock sum is a great first indicator, wideband, timing advance, and load. And if those values match up roughly to what you're expecting, then you hopefully don't have to do too much work on the tune, but it's also possible that they're all over the place. From the factory, you'll note that wideband is probably significantly richer than what we have here. And it's done that way intentionally for Mitsubishi for safety, because a richer fuel mix will be more resistant to knock. It will be more resistant to someone accidentally pumping lower octane fuel into the car, 87 or 91 instead of 93. And it'll waste gas, and it'll also reduce power output. So getting it up from the stock 10 range up into this mid 11 range is a great way to start adding power to your tune by taking away some of the fuel that Mitsubishi put in there from the factory. And the other thing would be making a timing map that kind of is appropriate, especially when you start changing the amount of boost that you run in the car. Because let's bounce out to ecuflash and bridge over to the next topic. We'll open up a fuel map and a timing map, and we'll look and see what happens as we start modding the car. Because most people, let's face it, you don't drive a stock Evo, you do at least something to it. So in most cases, people will increase boost on the car. It's a great way to make more power, more boost, more power. But what happens when you start changing the boost profile is you start hitting different values in these 3D maps. So from the factory, you may be progressing from this portion of the timing map down and across in this manner, where you're never really exceeding this boundary and going into this negative timing range. You know, at 2000 RPM, you may not be experiencing anything more than 120 or 140 load. But if you turn the boost up, and you recall load represents the air that the engine's consuming, you know, this could shift you over 3, 6, shift you over a considerable number of cells depending on how much boost you're running. So just by turning the boost up, you've drastically affected your tune. You could have potentially shifted yourself from maybe 8 degrees of timing to a complete opposite end of the spectrum. Maybe you're now running negative 9 degrees of timing. And timing, along with air fuel, are what are going to determine how much power your car makes. In general, more timing will make more power. So as you begin to turn up the boost, the same thing happens on the fuel map. If in the stock fuel map's case, in the stock configuration of the Evo, running 20 pounds, you know, you may only be hitting the 240 load column, and we're using AFR values in the mid-9s here. But as soon as you turn up the boost and you start progressing into these other columns, we're now hitting significantly richer, lower AFR values, and it's affecting the fuel mix significantly. So as you turn up the boost, you don't necessarily gain power out of the car. That's why a tune is a very important component in modding your Evo. If you want to gain power from the mods that you do, you definitely should have an appropriate tune that is aware of those mods, and you're definitely going to want to take full advantage of data logging to be able to understand what needs to change in these maps in order to get the most out of your tune. So if you're still following along and everything makes sense so far, what we can do at this point is we go back to our EvoScan log file, is we can start to match up. Now I can tell you straight off the bat that I'm definitely running, as we run 25, 26 pounds of boost, that's definitely more than stock. As you're probably familiar, stock Evo running about 20 pounds. So we've turned up the boost here, and we're still running positive timing. So that means this map has been tuned already. We're not on a stock map at this point. So these ECU flash maps won't necessarily match up with what this tune was in at this state at this time, but it's good. It's still good to show you for example's sake. So in this case, the engine's logging about 280 load at about 3160 RPM, which is approximately 24 pounds of boost and 4 degrees of timing. So let's assume, for example, that we want to try adding timing to these cells in order to get some more peak torque out of this car. What we would do is we would cross-reference this RPM value with this 2-byte load value and find the appropriate timing cell and then add some timing. So at 3160 RPM and 280 load corresponded onto our timing map, we can find the closest match, so maybe 3000 RPM and 280 load. And in this case, maybe we want to increment the timing by 1 degree from a -6 to a -5. Now, obviously, as I said before, this value in the map, that the log that we're looking at, is probably already a 4. So we could take it a 4 and make it a 5. But I'm just looking at a stock ROM right now. So that is kind of the idea of tracing through an EvoScan data log and cross-referencing it with your fuel and timing maps. The basics of tuning your car will come from this concept of tracking down where exactly in your 3D maps the car is going to, and then those are the values that you predominantly need to worry about. The other values you can worry about on a secondary basis after you've set up this profile. So after we've gone through and tuned this type of load curve, we'll go through and make other changes to loads below and above this to make it a smooth transition between cells. And that way the tune will be safe if we turn the boost up or down. If temperature changes significantly and boost changes, air density changes, the tune will still be appropriate. But in general, we just go with what we have. We tune these load cells at these RPM cells for the timing values that we like. So in the event that we have knock, as we scroll down, as a general indicator, knock predominantly is caused by too much timing. It can also be caused by too lean or significantly too rich of a fuel mix. In this case, with our fuel being 11.1, 11.4, 11.2, the cells around it, it's probably not too lean, not too rich. It's probably just too much timing at this case. So we'll again do this cross-reference. We'll find the 6600 or 6500 will probably be the closest match for RPM, and 237 or 240 load in our ecuflash table. 6500 and 240. So here maybe we want to pull a degree of timing or reduce a degree of timing, or maybe even 2 degrees of timing to see if that cures the knock. Hopefully it does. Now, you don't necessarily have to adjust just one cell at a time, and you don't necessarily just have to adjust the cells that the ECU is referencing here. In fact, it's good practice to adjust cells in groups so that they all kind of represent a nice progression from low values up to high ones as you progress down the RPM scale. So if I just left this as a 5 here, it doesn't really make much sense if we look at just this 240 load column. As we progress down the RPM scale, it should get progressively more aggressive as we go down the scale, but instead we end up with going from 2 to 3 to 6 and then down to 5. So that doesn't make much logistical sense, because as RPM goes up generally, so does timing. So if we're going to be lowering this cell value, we might as well lower this guy as well. We'll make him a 4. Now this makes more logical sense. We go from 2 to 3 to 4 to 5. And maybe just to be on the safe side, we want to pull a degree of timing here and make that an 8. So now we may have only needed to change just one cell, at least according to what our data log says. But for smoothness sake and for logical sake, we kind of want to edit the values that go around that cell as well. That'll also prove to be useful, as I said, when your boost is changing, when the weather changes, because these cell values that you're hitting when you drive the car will change slightly or significantly even. So the other thing to note, we noted that timing generally gets higher as RPM gets higher, but you also want to note that timing generally gets lower as load gets higher. So as we basically are having the engine do more work, throwing more boost at it, we can't run as much timing. That's just a fact of forced induction. You can't typically run as much timing as you would if you were running less boost. So that's just kind of the general idea you want to take into account as you're editing these values, is going down the RPM scale, we want to go ascending, and going across the load scale, we want to be descending. In terms of fuel, now we said that our data log looked pretty good for fuel, so we don't necessarily have to make any changes. But just to give you an idea of how the fuel map is laid out and how that progresses, you'll see that there's a lot of 14.7 values, especially in anything that's under 100 for the most part. And that's to be expected. 14.7 being the stoichiometric air-fuel ratio is a good target air-fuel ratio for the car when it's in open loop and when it's not really experiencing any significant boost or any significant load. As we go into boost and as we go down the RPM range, or up the RPM range I should say, the car is going to get progressively richer, which means lower AFR values, lower air for the same amount of fuel. So unlike the timing map, the fuel map is going to get lower as you progress down the RPM scale. And it'll also get lower as you progress across the RPM scale, the load scale rather. So these are just the stock maps. They don't necessarily represent what you should have in your tables. If your car's already been tuned by someone, they probably look completely different, and that's fine. But all you want to really remember is, as you're examining this data log, is the key points that you need to focus on initially are probably the ones that consist of knock. If you don't have any knock, that's great. You can start making improvements to the tune by adding timing or reducing fuel, depending on how your air-fuel ratio looks and how much timing you're currently running. But knock is definitely going to be the initial identifier of a problem with the tune. Hopefully I gave you some ideas of other places you can look for problems with the tune, whether it's a boost leak, whether it's a overly rich or overly lean condition, whether you're running out of injector or running out of fuel pump, and so on. The other identifier of a boost leak could be load values that are excessively high. While there's no exact conversion of boost to load or load to boost, you can kind of assume in the general sense that if you're only running 22, 23, 24 pounds of boost, that you're not going to be in the 300s for load on the stock turbo. So if you're seeing 300 2-byte load, 320 2-byte load, and you're only running 21 pounds of boost on the stock turbo, there's something going on there. You probably have a boost leak, you probably have could have a problem with the mass airflow sensor, could have a problem with the tune where the MAF hasn't been scaled properly. So there's a bunch of things you'll have to check in that case. But that would be one possible way to look for problems in the tune. So that should cover a lot of the basics of how you iterate through a data log and how you kind of step through your log, in this case a wide open throttle log, and identify the problem points if they exist, identify areas for improvement if they exist, and make some subtle changes in your ROM. And you can make small changes at first and make sure that you understand what you're doing, flash it back to the car, make sure everything works fine. You don't really have to be hesitant in making small changes to these maps because they're not going to have a huge impact on the car. But over time, these changes will add up into a better tune, into a smoother fuel curve, a smoother timing curve. And it's always good. You don't necessarily have to do it every time you flash the car, but if you're pretty content with your tune as is, if you recall our low octane maps we discussed in the previous video, should represent a more passive version of the high octane maps that we've been editing. And while I'm on the topic, the Evo 9 owners should note that you actually have 3 sets of timing maps. You have high octane 1, 2, and 3, and low octane 1, 2, and 3. There hasn't been any conclusive explanation of why this is, but what is conclusive is that at various times, the ECU will interpolate between these three maps. So if you want some consistency in your tune and you don't want to get frustrated over understanding why your changes don't seem to be taking effect or don't always seem to be taking effect, you can set all three high octane maps to be the same. You can just basically do a copy paste. You can select everything in map 1, hit Control C, and bump over to map 2, just select the first corner and Control V, paste it in. And you'll notice it highlights anything that's changed. But it's perfectly acceptable to run the same map in all three high octane maps if you have an Evo 9. If you have an Evo 8, you probably don't have anything but the single high octane map. And as far as the low octane map is concerned, an easy, quick, down and dirty way to set up a passive low octane map would be to paste in whatever you've set up to be your tuned high octane map, and then maybe select anything that's over 100 load, basically anything that's under boost we want to make a little bit more conservative. We can go in there and edit add to data, and maybe we'll take 3 degrees of timing off. So our low octane map will run 3 degrees less than our high octane map. That's not a bad place to start for a low octane map. And the same idea with the high octane map. Once you've got that a high octane fuel map, once you've got that set up, you can go ahead and do the same thing and transfer it to the low, and then you want to reduce the air fuel value maybe by a full AFR point to something a little bit richer in the event that you get significant knock and you need to richen it up and try to solve it. So we'll just take -1 off this guy. There's that. So that's the basic idea of what you're going to be doing as you data log your car. Is you're going to be cross-referencing data in your log with data in these ECU flash maps, making changes. I'd say just make small changes at first. Don't do anything that you're not too comfortable with, but also, don't be afraid to change, 2 or 3 values by 1 or 2 degrees of timing, and then relog the car, reflash the image to the car, and then redata log the car, and see how your changes took place, and see your changes in action. So some other things you might be worried about if you happen to have an Evo 9 is intake cam advance for your MyVec system. Now, there's been a lot of debate and a lot of development and testing done by a lot of different guys. John Bradley, I can think of off the top of my head, on Evolution M. But they've gone through a lot of different setups for MyVec. So there's really no straightforward way to log something with EvoScan and then come back in here and make a change that the MyVec map needs. I hate to say it, but it's a little bit more guesswork or a little bit more guess and check, or trying to understand the true theory behind MyVec, as what most people have tried to do on Evolution M forums. And when you, I'm not encouraging that you basically change these guys to arbitrary values and see if they work, but you will have to experiment a little bit, especially if you don't have stock cams or you don't have stock turbo, because what works for one car may not work for you at all. The same goes for timing and fuel. You really do need to log the car with the changes, making small changes every time you go, and try to figure out what it likes that makes good power and doesn't knock. So in terms of adjusting the MyVec map, I'll tell you right now, the best place to start is probably just taking the JDM version of the MyVec map that comes on the JDM Evo 9s and starting from there, because it's a more aggressive but also safe implementation of MyVec, and it seems to be a great place to start, especially for stock cam, stock turbo cars. The other thing I can show you, while we're here is looking at some of the boost tables. And even if you're using a manual boost control, you'll still want to be aware of what these tables do, and you may need to edit these values as well, especially if you're turning boost up significantly, because these tables will control boost cut, or more appropriately named fuel cut, in the event that the ECU believes you're overboosting. So the boost cut load table, what this is a 2D table that shows a list of RPM values and then a corresponding load limit value over which it will assume that you're overboosting. So if we bounce back to our EvoScan log real quick, and we see since I've turned the boost up on this turbo, and since I'm logging significantly more load than I would have in a stock setup, this car would basically always be exceeding these stock boost cut values. Remember, I was at 280, 270, 260 load, and basically at all times I would be, in the eyes of the stock ECU, I would be overboosting. And what it will do at that point is it'll reference this boost cut delay table, and it'll say, okay, if he's exceeding this amount of load for this amount of time in milliseconds, then something's wrong, cut fuel, and it'll basically feel like you hit a brick wall. Now the other probably bad habit that a lot of even professional tuners have gotten into, and maybe they do it because they don't want a customer to come back and say, what's wrong with my car, I keep hitting a brick wall, but they'll go in here and make this boost cut delay time or something extremely long, and basically what will happen is the ECU will never hit 1 million millisecond unless your car is just incredibly slow. You won't be experiencing that amount of boost for that amount of time. And that's basically a workaround. It's a hack job that I wouldn't recommend, because this is a good feature of the ECU. You would like it to be able to recognize when you're overboosting and cut fuel, because you don't want to be spiking 35 pounds and have the ECU do nothing about it. If the wastegate vacuum line pops off, something's wrong with your boost controller, this is a good feature to have in the ECU. So to just outright disable it, in my opinion, is not the best idea. So we can set this guy back to 1000 milliseconds the way it is from the factory. But what I may want to do is come in here and change these load values, because now that I'm running more boost, I'm going to be running more load. So if I set all of these guys to 290, that wouldn't be a bad place to start. But if you recall, the load tapers as we go down the RPM scale. So maybe 290 load is bad at 3000, but it's really bad at 7000, because there's no way that it should be hitting those values at that RPM. So we could just kind of progressively decrement this guy, and eventually we'll end up with, you know, a smoother boost cut load table. So this may be your approach. I mean, it's pretty open. There's no specific set way of doing it. This would just be one possible way to set up this table if you're turning up the boost, and you want to be able to have the fuel cut safety feature, but not necessarily have it cut fuel while you're doing a typical normal pull. So that's the boost cut or fuel cut table. If you happen to be using the ECU for your boost control, the other thing you'll have to worry about is the target load that the ECU is looking for. And the target load is along the same lines as the boost cut, the fuel cut table. Is it doesn't want you to exceed these target load values, and if it does, it'll try to reduce the amount of boost that the boost solenoid's bleeding away from the wastegate actuator. It'll allow the wastegate actuator to open up and thereby reduce how much boost you're running. So if you're still using the stock boost solenoid, you'll have to get more familiar with all these boost solenoid tables. In particular, you'll have to worry about the boost control load offset table, and also the boost desired engine load tables, which there are two of in my case in the Evo 9. And the way this works is this 2D table allows any value from 0 to 159.4, and for any values above that, it's basically expressed by the boost control load offset. So all this means is it'll take 80 plus 159 to determine what the actual desired engine load is. And as you can see, kind of as we did with our boost cut load table, is it starts off with a higher load and it progressively gets smaller as we expect the turbo to not be able to keep up in terms of airflow, in terms of load. So what the ECU will do is it'll add 80 to each of these values, and if you're exceeding that load value, the wastegate or the boost control solenoid will reduce its wastegate duty cycle. It will reduce how much air gets bled away from the wastegate, and the wastegate will reduce how much boost the turbo is producing. So again, if you're turning up the boost, you have a couple different ways of editing this. You can't really exceed 159.4 in this table, so maybe what you want to do is come in here and change the load offset to 110, and now that'll bump up, give us another 30 load on top of what we would typically have had from the normal desired engine load. Again, that doesn't apply to you if you use a manual boost controller, but it's still good to understand what it does. The other table you'd have to worry about is the wastegate duty tables, which there are a few of them. Baseline wastegate duty cycle is just an indication of how hard your boost solenoid is going to work to bleed air away from the wastegate. And by default, the restrictor pills that are in the vacuum lines from the factory, they don't restrict too much airflow from the wastegate actuator. So you have quite a bit of air getting through those vacuum lines. And that's intentional because that just means that even when this boost solenoid is bleeding away 100% of the air that it can possibly breathe away, there's still enough air to get to the wastegate to prevent you from exceeding approximately 20 pounds of boost. So if you aren't familiar with people who have allowed the stock boost solenoid to exceed 20 psi, they've probably done it by way of a custom boost pill that has a smaller passage for the air to come out of the turbo, the compressor housing, and go to the wastegate actuator. So less air getting to the wastegate actuator, more boost. And when you do that, these values will have to change, because no longer should you always bleed 100% of the possible air away. You may want to reduce that to 20 and start from there, because you won't know until you tune it how much boost you'll actually get out of it once you put in an aftermarket or a custom boost pill and take out the factory one. So those are the basics of tuning boost. The rev limits are pretty self-explanatory, so I don't think we need to go into too much detail on that. But again, if you understand the concept of data logging, you understand the concept of matching up load, timing, air fuel values to where they live in ecuflash, you'll be able to start tuning your map, whether it's a stock map, whether it's a map that someone else made for you, you got tuned and you want to check up on it. This same practice applies. You're basically logging and cross-referencing.